Everybody, welcome back to Din and Daf. This is Elana Stein Hain. And what we are doing today is we're going to talk about what I call the domino effect. The question of if you have a number of edim who are testifying together, let's say three, disqualification of one disqualify the other two. And the reason why I bring this up, this domino effect, is because we have a Gemara in Bava Batra, Daf Kuf Samach Bet Amud Bet, that says something very provocative, which is that even if you have, let's say, 4 or 5 signatures on a shtar, and 3 of them, let's say, are not valid witnesses, we assume that the other 2 valid witnesses, their witnessing is enough. So we do not say that there is a domino effect, that even though all 5 names are on the same shtar and 3 of them are invalid as witnesses, the other 2 are fine. The reason why this is provocative is because, in general, if witnesses came together to bear witness or give testimony to a murder that they saw, God forbid, or to a halva, why can't I think of the word, or a loan between 2 people. And it turns out that one of those witnesses was a karov, for example. One of those witnesses was related to one of the other witnesses or was related to one of the litigants. We would say the Edut dominoes, the Edut is done. And so the question is, what is the difference between these 2 cases? The edim hachatumin al hashtar, the witnesses that are signed onto a shtar, and let's say 3 out of 5 of them are karov, at least, related either to each other or to the bali din, right, to the people who are party to that shtar, or maybe even they're puzzle, meaning because they did an avera of some sort that makes them puzzle edut. We're still makayim the shtar with the other 2. Whereas in a case of people giving testimony, presumably bal peh, meaning with their mouths, we wouldn't say such a thing. Okay, so that's what I want to look at today, because I think it cuts to the heart of a few things. One thing I think it cuts to the heart of is some of what we've been talking about in terms of shtarot, right? The weird thing about a shtar is that it's just sort of sitting there as an evidentiary document, which is different from having edim who you can talk to and ask questions of, right? It's a static document that sits there, and the question of its credibility is always sort of a big question, I would say. The second to the heart of is a question about edut itself, right? Like, how much is edut something where we purposely chose to be made? We purposely chose to witness an event, l'shem edut, versus how much is edut, can it result from a situation where somebody happened to see an event, but they weren't thinking about it as, oh my gosh, I'm going to go be a witness to the event, right? So there are a few interesting things about edut that this brings up. So what I want to do first is I want to just look for a moment at the Toseftot that actually the Gemara that I mentioned is based on. Because while we have this in the Bavli, it's actually based on, or the earlier sources for this idea that you could have people signed on to a shtar where 3 of them are not kosher witnesses and 2 of them are, and we uphold the shtar nonetheless, comes from a Tosefta Gittin and a Tosefta Bava Batra. So the Tosefta Gittin is actually talking about a get, right? And it starts with something that our Gemara in Bava Batra is also talking about, that they don't want a 2-line gap between the body of the shtar and the signature of the edim. They're worried that that leaves the possibility of people putting things in there that aren't true. Okay, so the Tosefta Gittin Zayin Yud Aleph says Hirchiyat edim min haktav melosh shtei shitin pasul pachot mikan kasher. If the edim signatures are 2 or more shitin, 2 or more lines from the text, the main text of the uh, of this shtar, of this get, then it's a pasul shtar. But if it's less than that, then it's kosher. Get shechatmu alav chamisha edim. If you have 5 edim who signed a get, v'nimtzeu shlosha rishonim psulin, and the first 3 are pasul edut. Doesn't say if it's because they're krovim, they're related either to each other or to the parties on the get, or if they're psulim because let's say they're ganavim, right? Something like that. Titkayem edut bishar edim. Still, the other 2 edim, that's legitimate. We allow the get to stand through the other 2 edim. I want us to notice that in the Tosefta, it says specifically that it was the first 3 people who signed on the shtar, on the get, who were pasul. And similarly, when you look at the Tosefta in Bava Batra, Yud Aleph, similar thing. It's not talking about a get, it's just talking about a shtar, right? Essentially the same wording, right? And I'm going to skip to the end. Shtar shechatmu alav chamisha edim, v'nimtzeu shlosha harishonim krovin o psulin, right? A little bit different. If you have 5 edim signed on a shtar, and the first 3 that are listed there are either relatives or are pasul edut, titkayim edut bishar edim, right? The edut on the shtar exists through the other edim, right? So as I said, this is kind of provocative, and I want to show you why it's provocative. When you look at a Mishnah in the first parak of Makkot, you can find it on Daf Hain Amud Bet. The Mishnah says, "Al pi shnayim edim o shlosha edim yumat hamid." A pasuk in Devarim 17, based on 2 edim or 3 edim, a person will be put to death. And the Mishnah asks a simple question: Im mitkayemet ha'edut b'shnayim, lama piret ha'katuv b'shlosha? If edut can be done through 2 people, why does the Torah also say or through 3? And it gives a number of answers. And the last answer that it gives, that seems to be anonymous, but some people think it's a continuation from the answer before, says, Uma shnayim, just like if you have 2 edim only, nimtza echad mehen karov pasul, and it turns out that one of them is either a relative or is pasul edut, edutan b'tela, we would say that their testimony falls away. Af shlosha, likewise, even if there are 3 edim, nimtza echad mehen karov pasul, if even one of them is a relative or is pasul edut, edutan b'tela, even though the edut falls, even it's invalidated, even though you have 2 edim that in theory are kosher edim, right? Minayin afilu mea, how do we know that even 100 edim, if they were considered what we call a kat edim, a group of edim, right? That even if there were 100 and only one of them is found to be karv and pasul, that all of their edut would be gone, invalidated. Talmud Lamar edim, because the Torah repeats the word edim, right? It could have said al pi shnayim edim o shlosha, but instead it says al pi shnayim edim o shlosha edim, right? Now Rabbi Yossi says I have a caveat for this. I'm a Rabbi Yossi b'medvar mamurim b'dinei nefashim. That's the case when we're talking about capital crime. And parentheses, why would that be the case when we're talking about capital crime? Because we do whatever we can to get the capital criminal off death row, right? To prevent them from getting a harsh sentence. So if we find that one of the 100 edim is a karov or a pasul, perfect, invalidate. We don't like to do the death penalty, right? But when it comes to monetary matters, says Rabbi Yossi, titkayim hedut bishar. I have no problem with saying, okay, so one of them is a karov and a pasul, but you still have 2 that are good. One of them is a karov or a pasul. You still have 99 that are good. I'm starting to think like 99 edim on the wall, like that. You can tell I have a 10-year-old child. Okay, so that's what Rabbi Yossi says. He says, I think there should be a distinction. Maybe this is kind of a kula for dine nefasho, but for dine mamano, we shouldn't make the whole thing full. But Rebbe says, no. Echad dine mamonot, echad dine nefashot, whether it's dine mamonot or it's dine nefashot. And then comes, which makes you think something like, this isn't just a kula for dine nefashot. This is something maybe perhaps about edut itself, that when you come as a group, you are a group. And if one of you falls, the domino effect, you all fall. And then the Mishnah adds, ve'ematai, when is this the case? And it's hard to know, is that ve'ematai really on the dine nefashot case, or is it trying to give us something paradigmatic even for dine mamonot? Because you'll see in a minute. Ve'ematai bizman shehitru behen. At the time, in a situation where the edim gave hatra'ah, the edim gave warning. Now, this is interesting because that doesn't apply in a dine mamonot case, right? Edim giving warning is going to apply in a case where somebody is doing something asur, right? So it probably relates more to the Dina Nefashot case. So why would it be that we say the Edut falls away, the domino effect applies when they gave hatra? Because it makes it sound like they know that they're edim, right? They know that they're edim. They know that in order to be edim, they have to give a warning, don't do that. And then the perpetrator has to do it, right? So obviously they meant to be edim. They weren't just casual observers. But if they didn't give hatra'ah, then of course, just because one of them is a karov or a puzzle, it doesn't mean that the others can't give their edud. Why? Because mayasu shnei achin shera'u be'achad sheharaget nefesh. What happens if, God forbid, two brothers happen to see a murder, right? Let's say there are two brothers who see a murder. Obviously, they're krovim to each other, so they can't come witness as a, a as a cot, right, together. But I assume they're not the only two people in the world who saw this. So let's say there's two brothers and there's another kosher aid or five other kosher edim that are around. Are you telling me that neither brother is allowed to go and give edut because his brother was there and also saw it? No, it has to be that they were mitkavein, that they wanted to come together as a kat, as a group, right? So already the Mishnah, on the one hand, gives us something that complicates our Gemara in Bava Batra, right? Because our Gemara in Bava Batra says the first three are Krovin or Psulim, the last two, it's fine. And this Mishnah says, actually, at least in Dine Nefashot, maybe even in Dine Mamonot, if there's a one aid who's puzzle or karov, the whole edut falls away. But this Mishnah also gives the beginning of an answer by saying this Bamed Devar Mamurim situation, or the Ve'ematai. When is this the case? Bisman Shehitrubahen, which makes it sound like they actually had kavana together to be a kat of edim. So perhaps one of the things that we could already say, or one of the ways that we could already start getting around our problem, is to say that if we're talking about a situation where people came together, l'shem edut, or witnessed something, l'shem edut, to be a kat of edim, then the domino effect applies. But if they didn't, which maybe is the case of our shtar, which we'll have to see, right? Then just because three of them are puzzle or karov doesn't mean it has an impact on the rest, right? So it maybe already contains the beginnings of a difference between the two situations. Maybe it's a situation where in the shtar case, we don't assume that they came together to be a kat of edim, whereas in these cases, in the Mishnah and Makkot, where we're looking at a situation where they actually came to be edim together. But let's actually see three different let's actually see three different approaches to this question of what is the difference between our situation where edim chatumin al shtar and the first three, or maybe any three, but the Tosefta says the first three are not kosher, and the next two are, where we say, let's go for it, as opposed to the Mishnah and Makkot, where the domino effect obtains. Okay. I'm actually going to skip the Rambam. Maybe we'll come back to the Rambam, but I want to kind of assume that the Gemara, or really the Mishnah, in saying that if they did hatra together, that tells you something about the domino effect. But if they didn't, then of course we can't say that there's going to be a domino effect, because then it means that if two brothers are present at a sin or a murder or something, then neither of them is allowed to give edut. So I just want to show you for a minute that the Gemara in Makkot continues and does a little bit more. Okay, it just does a little bit more. So Amar Rabbi Yossi, Bamed Devarim Amurim, meaning it's the Rabbi Yossi says, does it apply Dine Mamonot or Dine Nefashot? It only applies to Dine Nefashot, and then it's connecting the Bamed Devarim Amurim, or maybe Ematai is to Maya Asu Shnei Achin. So we say Hechi Amrina Lahu. So what do we actually say to these people, right? These edim, when they come, in order to ascertain whether they gave hatra or they didn't give hatra. So Rava says it's not about hatra. That's not what it is. It's not about the giving a warning. It's Amarava Hachi amrinan lahu. This is what we say to them. Lemechze atitu. Did you come to just see something that happened, like observe it? Olas hude atitu. Or did you come to witness something that happened? I amri las hude atu. If they say, we came to give testimony or to testify, to witness, really, like when we saw the thing happening, we were there thinking we are witnesses. Nimtza echad mehan karov or puzzle. If one of them is a karov or is puzzle, edutan betela, their edut is nullified. I amri lemechse atu. But if they say we came just to observe something that's going on, where the bottleneck effect, when you're a rubberneck on the highway, people are just looking, like human interest story, what's going on. Then in that case, how could you possibly say that if one aid is a karov, then they can't join up with somebody else just because their brother was there? It doesn't make any sense. They didn't come to actually be a kat of edim. Right? So let's say the key idea here is that if there is a kat of edim, right? If there's a group of edim that actually considers themselves a group for the purpose of edut, then if you have one of them who's a karov or a pasul, then the domino effect will obtain. But if you have a group that doesn't necessarily consider themselves a kat, right? They don't necessarily consider themselves a group of edim together, then even if one or two or three of them are pasul, then as long as there are two others that are kosher, we're good to go. Now, the question is, when it comes to edut ba'al peh, we can actually ask the edim, what did you witness this for? Did you see that event thinking of yourself as a witness and as witnesses, or did you just casually see that event? But what about on a shtar, right? Well, first of all, the question is like, if we could find the edim on the shtar, would we ask them and say, hey, did you mean to all be one kat or not? Are we assuming that the situation that we're looking at in our Gemara is a situation where we can't find the edim, we can't talk to them, maybe they passed away, maybe they're somewhere else? Or is it even that if we could ask them, we don't ask them? So I want to look at a few different explanations of why this case of shtar seems to be different, okay, than a case of edut ba'al peh. So the first, and I know it's out of order, but sometimes my mind works that way. The first is the Mordechai on Bava Batra, okay? The Mordechai on Bava Batra says something very interesting, almost indicating that even if we could find the edim, we wouldn't ask them if they meant to be one kat, okay? The Rabbeinu Tam, the Rabbeinu Yitzchak, Pasku, so the Rabbeinu Tam and the Re ruled the B'chol Hashtarot, that on any document, contract, Hecha Chatimin Hakrovin O Hapsulim Limala, if those that are relatives or those that are pasul edut are signed above the kosher edim, right? The amrinan lemilui chatmu. We assume that they only signed those family members or those psulim le'edut in order to fill up that 2 line of blank space on the shtar. V'had Amar Rabbi Akiva, the parak Aleph de Makkot, and that which Rabbi Akiva says in the first parak of Makkot, which I said to you in the Mishnah, it's not attributed to anybody, but some people think it's attributed to whoever came before, which is Rabbi Akiva. Ma shnayim nimtza echad mehan karov upasol edutan b'tela. Just like in a case where there are only 2 edim, if one of them is a karov or a pasul, their edut is domino effect invalidated. Then af gimel, so too if there were 3, if even one of them is found karov and pasul, that would also be invalidated, etc. Right? So Mordechai says, I'm aware that it looks like we have a Mishnah that actually undermines what I just said about the edim on the shtar. Hani mile be'edut al peh. That's only if it was edut given with the mouth And then we ask them and say, did you mean to be kat edim together? Aval b'shtar, but edut that's in a shtar, ain't tzarich lachkor l'shem mi chatmo. We don't have to do a chakira. We don't have to interrogate why they signed it. Da edim hachatumen al hashtar, because edim that are signed onto a shtar, harei kemisha nechkara edutan bebeitin dami. It's like their edut has already been interrogated in beitin. Uki'ilu nechkar delamilui chatmu. And it's as though we already interrogated them and found out that they only signed it to fill the blank space. They didn't sign it really as a kat of edim together. They only signed it to fill a blank space. So I think this is absolutely fascinating. The distinction that's being made here is, if it was edut bal peh, you'd ask them, did you mean to be a kat edim? But if it's edut bichtav, if it's edut in a shtar, we don't ask them, because when you see edim b'shtar, you assume whatever you assume about them. And here, what are we assuming? Assuming that because the non-kosher ones are first, they're just there to fill a gap between the body of the shtar and the kosher edim. Interesting, make a distinction. Sounds like even if I could find the edim, I wouldn't even ask them. I just assume. Great. Let's go up to the Rashbam. Rashbam has a different perspective. Rashbam says, I'm going to quote Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda, Nami mokila laha dechizkiya behilchot edut shelo. He says, that which Chizkiah says, and remember, Chizkiah is also in our Gemara Bava Batra, Kuf Samach Bet Amud Bet. Remember, it says, Chizkiah allows you to do milui shtar, to fill the empty lines in between the tofes, in between the content of the shtar and the edim with karov and pasol. Says that's tahava karov chatim bereisha, right? It has to be that it's the karov is signed first. Okay. Again, this karov being signed first business, which is what showed up in the Tosefta, right? Not everybody has that girsa, certainly not in our Gemara, right? So why? And then he goes back and says, why do we have to say this? We have to say this so that it doesn't undermine what we learn elsewhere, that if you have one aid that's a problem, then all of their aid is invalidated. And I'm skipping to the next line. It says, because the heicha dechatim karav bereisha, if a family member, if a relative signed first on the shtar, muchacha bilta, you know what it tells us? Dila kavod of it, that it was for the sake of honor, velo le'edut chatme, and not for the sake of edut, right? Really, really interesting. What does it mean that, is it that I was giving kavod to a family member to have them sign first on the shtar, even though it's not for edut, it's just to have their name on it? It was that they were doing a kavod for me by putting their name. I'm thinking maybe of the former, but it is kind of interesting to consider, well, maybe what we're talking about here is, probably still, we're maybe filling gaps between the main body of the text and the edim. But either way, the fact that you have a family member first, maybe it's like you want to give them the kavod of having their name on what's going on, but they're not really edim. Really kind of interesting, and just really kind of interesting. It's like it kind of goes to the heart of, as opposed to when we're talking about edut bal peh, where we're not messing around and we basically say, okay, we need edim here, right? In edut bishtar, we kind of are like, well, maybe we want people's names on this, not just for the sake of being edim, right? It kind of reminds me, maybe we could go back to edut bal peh. It kind of reminds me, it's like you're under a chuppah and there are only two people there who are there l'shem edut. There are a lot of other people there who are there l'shem kavod, right? So, and that's edut bal peh. So it's kind of an interesting question of the possibility of including people in a legal contract for the sake of giving them kavod. And by the way, the Mordechai who we mentioned before, he starts his comments by talking about how sometimes shushbinim, how sometimes groomsmen would sign not as edim, but as like, I'm the shushbin and I'm signing because I'm the shushbin, right? Like something significant about that. Okay. Then we have a third approach to this, right? Remember the first approach, the Mordechai saying, Edut bechtav, kimishin echkara edutan bebeitin, dummy. When we see it on a shtar, we can make lots of assumptions about it. We don't need to even ask, and it's so obvious to us. There was obviously a gap here that needed to be filled in, and the people who are in there, they're not edim, they're actually just filling a gap, right? Like schach puzzle, so to speak. The Rashbam, this is actually a situation where you were just trying to honor somebody. That's what we're looking at here. They weren't supposed to be a katavid. The Rimigash has something different to say, which I think is also kind of indicates something, or not also, I should say, like the Mordechai, maybe indicates something that's different between a shtar and Edut, right? Which is, well, who's to say that all the edim who signed on the shtar did so with the permission of all the other edim? Like they might not have even all signed at the same time, right? So the Rimi Gash says, "Hayu arba'a v'chamisha chatumin al shtar v'nimtza echad mehen karvu pasol titgayim edu b'shar." Excuse me, quotes our Gemara, or really our right, really quotes our Gemara, right? Because it says nimtza echad mehen, not the Rishonim or the Rishon, right? One of them is karvu pasol. It says Vahid Itznan b'Makkot, that which we learn in the Mishnah in Makkot, Mashnayim Nimsa Echad Mehen Karav Apostle Edutan B'Tela Af Shlosha, etc. But what we learn in the Mishnah in Makkot, which seems to undermine that, he says, wait, let me make it clear. That Mishnah in Makkot, where the domino effect applies, Daf could be a duad and itkavnu laha'id or lachton ke'echad. It's only when we know that they had kavana to testify, or really to witness together. I don't know why I keep saying testify, to witness the situation together as edim. And here it says, or lachtom, or to sign together as edim. Aval in ein yadua shenitkavnu shneim lachtom o laha'id ke'echad. But if it is not known, right? If it is not known, where's the burden of proof? If it is not known that they plan specifically to witness or to sign together, hashtar kasher, the shtar is kosher, betitkayem ha'edut bishar, right? It says, and the rest of the edut and the shtar should be upheld by the rest of the edim. She'im hapasol levasof, because if the invalid witness signed at the end, yesh lanu lomar shehosif chatimato shelo midat haksherim, maybe that person added their signature without even the knowledge of the other two edim who are ksherim. V'i betchila, and if it's at the beginning, chatam, that they signed, yesh lomar hanach ksherim, revacha shavku laman dekashish minayu. Maybe those ksherim who signed, maybe they left a little space before their names, thinking that somebody older than they are was going to sign and wanted to give the room, but they weren't actually with that person necessarily. Now, what happens if they signed be'emtza? That's an interesting question, right? If you have kosher aid here, non-kosher aid, then kosher aid, then what? Like, how do we explain that? Looks like they were all kind of doing this together, right? You can't say that they were just filling some space, and you can't. So that's a little bit complicated. But suffice it to say, what we're looking at here is the possibility on a shtar, which I think that possibility exists a little bit more clearly on something that is a document in writing, possibility on a shtar that somebody could put their name on something without even the knowledge of the other edim at all. And therefore, they're not considered a kat. But suffice it to say, no matter which one of these you take, one thing is for sure, edim can be considered a kat. Edut is not simply I'm giving edut, it's we're giving edut. And secondly, it is possible that there might be other reasons why a person's name might appear on a shtar other than them being there as a legitimate witness. Maybe they're trying to just fill the space, or maybe this is something that is supposed to give them honor, or maybe they signed it without permission, right? Hopefully this gives us a little bit more to think about in terms of the role of edim in a shtar and how that does and doesn't connect with the role of edim or the status of edim ba'al peh. Thanks, everybody. Looking forward to learning together next time.